Hello. This is a technique that I've been developing for starting single crochet in the round, although it may be useful for other types of crochet in the round too. I'm calling it a reverse Slipknot Round Start, and I thought of it while watching a video of binding, however it's pronounced, which is the precursor of knitting and crochet, and it's sometimes called Viking knitting, though that's not the most accurate because it was everywhere else as well. Anyway, in a video by Untitled about how to do Oslo stitch in binding, there's a link in the description to that video, by the way, if you're interested. They demonstrate how to start off in the round, and it's done with a slip stitch, but instead of the variable end being on the side of the wool, the variable end is on where the tail is. And I thought, hey, why can't I do that with crochet? And it turns out you mostly can. So, some thanks to Nørlekintat, again, sorry for my pronunciation, for inspiring this. And if you're interested in checking out binding, their videos are really excellent for teaching so far that I've found. Now, the reverse Slipknot Round Start, which here's an example of it. First stitch being around there, that isn't in the slipknot, it's something that's so simple that I'm sure someone's done it before, especially considering how in structure is quite similar to the magic loop, which I'll talk about later. But so I'm sure someone else has done it before, but I haven't seen any guides on it or mentioned in this of doing this in this way in any of the guides of how to start in the round. So I thought I'd make a video about it. Now, while I'll show you what I've developed, there are likely a lot of improvements and variations you could make, which I encourage you to experiment with. Since crocheting isn't necessarily my forte, though I have made some things that I'm quite proud of, like, hooray, I made the pattern for this. Anyway, enough bragging. But this technique, again, I'm not the most expert in crochet. And so I'm sure someone who is interested in crochet, even if they're not an expert, I'm sure that other people could experiment and come up with different ways of doing this and ways of doing it better. And I encourage you to. This technique seems to particularly work fairly well in single crochet. Specifically when you're not doing a slip stitch to join the round, you're just doing it in a spiral, which is how I do things like amigurumi and probably how I'd approach a beanie if it's single crochet. But it's possible that it does work in double crochet and other half double and all other stitches. I'm not entirely sure about it though, because again, like doing double crochet in the round isn't really my forte. So again, I encourage you to experiment with this. So I'm going to assume that you have some basic knowledge about crochet and about starting in the round, slip knots, and maybe even the magic loop, which I will talk about later in the video. Okay, so to do this start, you first need some yarn, an appropriately sized crochet hook, and a safety pin, which is something I recommend for crocheting the round anyway, because it really helps with keeping track of where you are in the row, because you can just mark the first stitch of the round. So normally when you do crochet just with a chain, you start with slip knot, except the variable end, the end that when you pull it, it closes the loop, that's on the yarn side. However, for this start, which is why I call it reverse slip knot, you make a slip knot with the variable end being the tail side. And there we go. So we're essentially going to crochet into this tail, or into this loop rather. So, and we're also going to make it the first round have 6 stitches total. The first stitch can either be the first stitch of the round, or actually the last stitch of the round. I'll show you what I mean. So first, you have the slip knot like this. You can single crochet into this, onto this thread, or the variable thread, or the fixed thread. I haven't found much difference in what I was in my testing, but again, maybe that's something to look into. First, you put the the needle through the loop, and you pull the yarn through like this. Then you pull the yarn through the loop you just put on your needle, like that. And this makes a sort of slanted looking stitch. You can sort of see it, and you can pick it up with your safety pin, which I would encourage you to do, otherwise it will probably fall apart a little bit. I'll also move this tail just out of the way so it doesn't twist too much. So we've got this stitch pinned, and now we can single crochet 5 into the loop. And yes, so in this case, I'm counting the stitch we just pinned as the first stitch, but if you, except I don't count it as the first of the 5, just the first stitch of the round. If you want though, you could also do the 5 single crochets and slip stitch into it, and then it'll become the last stitch of the round. And then in subsequent rows, you can just crochet into it as you would normally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1. Excellent. So we could pull this tight a little bit if we wanted to try and close up the loop. But first, I'm going to start the second round before I do that, actually, because it will make it a lot more fixed in place. So I'm undoing the safety pin and picking up these 2 loops just as a normal stitch. And I'm going to single crochet into it twice, as in this fairly standard single crochet increase that you see in a lot of circles if you've done too many of them, or any really of single crochet. So that's the first single crochet done. Now let's reach into the same place and do the second single crochet. And now I'll do the 3rd and 4th stitches of the round, which should be into this stitch. And again, 2 single crochet. I'll just do it with the front loop because it's being... Oh wait, no, it picked up both loops. There we go. It was being a bit stubborn. But that's alright. Just persist. So those are the first 4 stitches of the round. But now I'm going to tighten up the center, which you just pull on the yarn. Make sure that nothing got caught or is in any loops. And now you can just continue along as normal, single crochet in each of them until you get to the first stitch of the 3rd round, and then I do single crochet increase, single increase, mostly just because I like the first stitch not being an increase itself, but that's a personal preference. Okay, but you can see it becomes a lot more, yeah, you can see the hole is all tightened up, and so there's very little hole there. I'll just demonstrate quickly, and when you continue that, it will eventually become something resembling this, as long as you just do a standard circle pattern. And I'll show you the other way of, oh bother. I'll show you about doing it as with the first stitch as the last stitch of the round as well. So starting off this, also this is another way of doing the first, for safety pinning the first stitch, is you insert the hook into the loop, pull through the yarn, then put the safety pin around here. Seems a little bit weird, but okay. It does work. Trust me on this. Well, I'll show you. So it just sits there for now. But when we pull the yarn through again, like making a chain, the bit under it locks it into place, and otherwise it just acts as the normal stitch. And then from here, we can just single crochet 5 again. And now pull on this a little bit, not too much, especially because it might tighten up the first stitch last stitch now, a little too much. Oh, where's this one? Oh yeah, it's just a little bit frictiony by the looks of it. Yeah, there we go. It's working. So I could treat, and this time I'm going to treat this as the last stitch of the round. So I'm going to put it on the needle and do a slip stitch. So pull through and then pull through again without actually knitting it. And that can be treated just as the last stitch of the round, and this one is then treated as, this one right next to it is then treated as the first stitch of the round, and so I would single crochet 2 into it. And it does work. It definitely works. And etc. I'll show you. Let's see, where was it? Which one? Right. Here's a little comparison between the two of the single crochet ones that I've been experimenting. This one is the first one where I treat it as the first stitch, and yeah, you can see it's maybe a very small bump there visibly, but you can't really feel that on the back. It's nice and smooth there. Maybe a small bump visibly, but it's definitely not too bad, no hole or anything. Here is the one that, yeah, the first stitch being around here along this line. The one where I treated it as the last stitch, and it's maybe slightly bumpier. It's not too big a difference, surprisingly. And again, yeah, not much of a hole, not much of a bump on the back. It looks fine, feels fine. Okay, so what about doing it in double crochet? I showed a little bit of this earlier, and again, I'm not entirely sure. You can kind of see where the row joins. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about this, but here's what I did to achieve that if you're interested in picking up this idea and developing it a little further. So, again, starting with the same slip knot. Not in the slip knot. Oh well, that's fine. For now. I'm not if I were actually doing something, I'm just demonstrating this. So, do the first stitch as normal. then chain another one. I'm just going to safety pin now, doing the same thing as what I did there in the previous one, but I'm going to safety pin this now. We're actually going to do a similar slip stitch into it like the previous one as well, and then I go double crochet 1, well, double crochet 9 in fact, because there's 10 stitches in this round. Now instead of trying to do a spiral, which I don't think works terribly well with double crochet in the round, yes, this would be the second double crochet, but I'll just, yeah, so you have the double crochet, and this loop here being pinned. I'll just substitute it for one that I prepared earlier. Okay, so here, get the loop in the right direction. Yeah, there's the loop in the right direction now, yes. So you can see there's this pin. Yeah, the pin is in this chain, really. Then 9 double crochet. So before I tighten the loop, I'm going to slip stitch into this, into the place where I safety pinned. And that'll be the last stitch of the round. At least this is what I've developed so far. I'm not exact, it might be, like this is definitely one of the places I can definitely see it being, I didn't actually go into the stitch, but into the column, but that should be right. And this one I will tighten up just after that. You can, this is something that does sometimes happen when I try and do the slip stitch as the last stitch. For some, no, never mind, that is actually just the loop being caught up in itself. So that was wrong, disregard that. Oop. Sorry. So yes, here's this. And then I would, if I were to continue this, chain 2 and then start doing some increases and going round and such. That's the idea that, that's the principle of doing the double crochet that I've developed so far, which led to this, which is not perfect. Like there's no bumps or anything, but anyway, that's definitely an area that could be improved. So, the reverse Slipknot Round Start is inevitably going to be compared to the magic circle method of starting in the round. Don't get me wrong, the magic circle method is really useful. I've used it many times on many projects myself. But there are some features about both of them which may make you lean towards one or the other in certain projects. While I am comparing them, ultimately they do end up fairly similar. So these comparisons are a bit less impactful than I might make them seem. One difference which strikes me is that when I do the magic loop, I often forget exactly what I'm doing. Since you're meant to make a cross, then take that yarn there, then pull that yarn through it, I get a bit confused sometimes and forget where I am, what I'm doing. The reverse Slipknot Start seems a bit more intuitive to me then, since all you're doing is you're making a slip knot and pulling the working yarn through a loop twice, which is very similar to everything else in crochet. A related difference is the amount of thread used. With the magic loop, I'm not always sure how long the tail is going to be, and consequently how much thread is going to be used. The reverse Slipknot Start guarantees that the tail ends at the base of the slip knot. While that length of thread is pretty insignificant when you're using a full ball of wool, if you're making things out of scrap yarn and leftovers, sometimes every centimeter counts. Of course, there are points where the magic loop has an advantage. I suspect that the reverse Slipknot Start will, if it gets a lot of tension and pulling and wear, it'll start to come loose, but if at the end is sewn in, especially if it's made of a material like wool, that probably isn't an issue. The magic loop is probably a little bit stronger, since it has 2 threads in the center, But this is something I'd encourage people to experiment with. Another difference is that the reverse Slipknot Start has a very small visual bump on the right side, or at least seems to. It's kind of hard to tell, really, but the magic loop seems to look very slightly cleaner. Again, I don't think there's really that big of a difference. In terms of feel, the reverse Slipknot Start has no bump on the back, and for the magic loop there's maybe a slight bump, but not much difference, really. Finally, the magic loop is probably better for double and half double crochet, mostly because I don't know enough about those stitches in the round to develop the start properly for them. Anyway, I hope this technique is useful to you in your crocheting practice, and I would encourage you to experiment with and develop it. See you!